Welcome to Forum at 360. I'm Jeremy Shea. Today we're discussing how industrial chemicals that are linked to cancer and developmental problems have found their way into the subsistence food web, our homes, and our bodies. In the first half of the show, we'll discuss how the Arctic fits in globally, how these chemicals are getting so far north, and why, according to many international scientists, indigenous peoples with traditional diets have been measured with some of the highest concentrations of these industrial contaminants in their bodies in the world. In the second half, we'll talk specifically about toxic flame retardants that are ubiquitous in our household goods and some of the policy efforts at the state level aimed at curbing their use while preserving fire protection. Our first guests are with the Alaska Community Action on Toxics organization. Pam Miller is the organization's founder and executive director, and Vi Waghiyi is from Savoonga, and she coordinates the organization's community-based research on St. Lawrence Island. Thanks for joining us on Forum at 360.
Welcome, glad to be here.
Thanks. Pam Miller, since you're the founder and executive director of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, tell us what your organization is and what it does.
Sure. We're a statewide environmental health and justice research and advocacy organization, and we work with communities doing community-based research and advocacy really to protect families and people who are most vulnerable, including children, people who rely on subsistence diets, mothers, the elderly, and people with chronic diseases, to protect them from exposures to toxic chemicals that can be found in our air, water, and food.
And you yourself, you're a research biologist by training yourself
Yes.
as well, right?
Yes.
Okay. And Vi, you grew up in Savoonga and Nome. Tell me about the study you're doing on St. Lawrence Island with subsistence food.
My name is Vi Waghiyi. I'm the daughter of the late John and Della Waghiyi. I'm a St. Lawrence Island Yupik mother and grandmother. I was born and raised in Savoonga on St. Lawrence Island. Annie Aloha, a former health aide, she started noticing a lot of cancer in our Northeast Cape families that had lived, worked, and camped at Northeast Cape, one of the two formerly used defense sites. Excuse me, one of the two formerly used defense sites on our island. Because of our proximity to Russia, the Air Force came and established these two bases. And Annie tried to get help for our people for 20 years. She got sent to agency, to agency, to agency, and in 7 years, or 20 years came around full circle with to 7 agencies. She started noticing a lot of cancer in our families, low birth weight babies, miscarriages. And Annie went to environmental conference in Anchorage, and Pam heard her talk, and the two of them got together. And this was one of the first times anybody had listened to Annie. She was a former health aide. We have clinics in our community, Snow Hospital. We're located in the northern Bering Sea. And because of her concerns, and with the help of Alaska Community Action on Toxics, or ACAT, we have had a community-based participatory research project on our island. We've been trying to hold the military accountable all these years. They were very negligent. One of the bases they abandoned, and the other they dug big pits and buried everything. But we're also some of the most highly contaminated population on the planet because of our reliance on our subsistence foods from global contaminants that arrive into the Arctic through air and ocean currents. Even though we don't have manufacturers or chemical plants, we're finding them in our environment. They end up in on our lands, affecting our health and well-being, and also the subsistence foods that we have relied on for many, many generations. We're basically being contaminated without our consent. So it's...
What are some of those subsistence foods out in St. Lawrence Island?
In our region, in the Bering Straits region, we're behind Little Diomede as far as eating the most subsistence foods because of their isolation. They get limited flights in and out of their community. We're also located on an island, and So we, about 80 to 70% of our homes eat only traditional foods, a way of life that we have lived for many, many generations. We are connected to our lands spiritually, traditionally, and culturally. So it's not just food for us, it's our identity, our culture. And so the global contaminants that are ending up in our traditional foods are causing health harms in our people. During the 1950s, either a missionary or a teacher that came to our island noticed only one cancer. And today we have a cancer crisis. But also our healthcare system is broken. So it's a very big issue. However, we are here and very dedicated to make changes, meaningful changes, so that we can protect the health and well-being of our people.
And you use that term, community-based research. You've got an ongoing study on St. Lawrence Island, correct?
Yes.
And that's specifically of the subsistence foods that are eaten there, right?
Basically, as I mentioned, this project started because of the concerns that Annie mentioned from the contamination that we've identified at the two former Air Force bases. We have been funded from the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, which is a federal agency. We've done environmental and health research to look at contaminants that the military base at Northeast Cape. It was a pretty big installation. And then at the other end of our island, the community of Gamble today is on top of the waste site. So the burden of proof has been put on us, and we've been trying to hold the military accountable. Our leadership and community members are very involved in this research. They help design the research.
And can you describe what the community members there are actually doing? You know, how are they actually collecting samples, and what are they actually testing for?
We hire and train local people. We have community health researchers. We're able to do the research ourselves. We've done environmental sample collection, including groundwater, soil, air, plants and berries. And at the request of our leadership, when we, at the beginning of this project, we had the blood of our people tested first of 3 groups. St. Lawrence Island, Savoonga residents closely associated with Northeast Cape, and Gamble residents. And out of those 3 groups, our Northeast Cape families that live in Savoonga have 10 times more PCB levels in the blood of our people than the average American in the lower 48. And
Why don't I stop you there, and why don't you explain to us what PCBs are? Maybe this is for
Sure.
Pam?
Sure. Well, PCBs stands for, it's an acronym that stands for polychlorinated biphenyls. And these are industrial chemicals that were produced and used from the 1940s and 50s into the 1970s, used in electrical capacitors, electrical applications, and paints to reduce their flammability and combustion, because they're very heat resistant and they degrade very slowly. So they're highly persistent and toxic, and even though they were banned in the 1970s in the United States, they're still very prevalent in the Arctic. They're transported, as Vi mentioned, on wind and ocean currents, so they can end up in the Arctic from hundreds and thousands of miles from lower latitudes. But they were also used by the US military in places like St. Lawrence Island. So the people of St. Lawrence Island were very highly exposed from the military contamination, but also because of the long-range transport of these chemicals into their region, and because these chemicals are concentrating in traditional foods. And we're also finding very high levels of PCBs in the traditional foods, including seals and walrus and whales.
You say they're persistent, meaning they don't break down, they don't go away.
Yes.
And they stay with organisms, with organic animals and critters, right?
Yes, they don't break down for decades in our bodies, in the environment, in the animals where they accumulate. They tend to like to accumulate in the fatty tissues of animals and people, so that we're finding especially high levels in the rendered oils and blubber of the seals and walrus that people rely on.
And these are the things that you said were found in blood at 10 times the level, was that right?
Yes,
Of what you might
in the
expect.
blood of our people. We have lived a subsistence lifestyle, and these contaminants build up in the marine mammals that we live off of. We collected over 300 samples, tested one batch for PCBs and pesticides, and another batch for heavy metals. And it's very alarming that these global contaminants, persistent organic pollutants, or POPs, we're finding them in our foods. And the injustice done to people that live in the Arctic, the multinational corporations that make and produce these toxic chemicals, are driven by profit. They don't take human health into account, and most people have no idea, let alone that we're being exposed from contaminants, whether it's through our subsistence foods or in the products that we buy for our homes or use in our homes.
And so you grew up in the subsistence lifestyle, right?
Yes.
And have you had any personally, have you had any health risks or health effects that you think might be linked to having that subsistence lifestyle and having that exposure?
As Pam mentioned, PCBs, they're very persistent. Some of the health harms that we're seeing in both Savoonga and Gamble, PCBs are known to cause cancer, low birth weight babies, miscarriages, diabetes, heart disease. And as Alaska Native people, we hear all the time the risk factors of smoking and drinking. And however, it's so hard to properly diagnose and treat environmental health effects. But we have many sources of exposure and all these different toxic stew of exposures that we're seeing. So, the health harms that we're seeing were never seen before until after the military left, but also because of our reliance on our traditional foods.
And have you personally had any health?
Personally, I've had 3 miscarriages myself. Both of my parents had cancer. And as I speak today, I have 2 relatives that in my immediate family that are probably coming toward the end of their life. I have a brother that just found out he has cancer. I have 2 first cousins that have been fighting cancer. And I've lost many relatives to cancer. We do have a cancer crisis. And when we go to the doctor, a lot of times, by the time we find out we have cancer, it's too late. And it's not that if I will get cancer, it's just a matter of time, because it's, in 2011 and 2012, we averaged 19 cancer deaths. And in 2013, I believe it increased 3-fold.
This is just on St. Lawrence
That's
Island.
correct.
Wow.
And we have a community of 700 people in Savoonga and 800 in Gamble. And at one time we had 4,000 people and 32 communities, and now it's come down to about 1,500, and some of us that have moved away and working. I live and work in Anchorage. I'm a mother of 4 boys, but I have family that continue to live there.
So this is just one island, one area in Alaska, but teams of scientists working for the Arctic Council, an international intergovernmental forum of Arctic states, have established that this is a circumpolar issue. This is much bigger than just St. Lawrence Island. The traditional diets dependent on critters high up on the food chain are a common thread. Have I got that right? Okay. And Marla Cohn, an LA Times environmental reporter who wrote Silent Snow, The Slow Poisoning of the Arctic in 2005, we've got a copy right here, called it the Alaska paradox. It's how could people living in places that seem so pristine be carrying all these chemicals in their bodies? I'll set that there.
It's really an interesting story. The understanding of the contamination of the Arctic began to happen in the about the mid-1980s, when a group of scientists from Health Canada were doing a study looking at contaminants in breast milk. And they were planning to do this study with women in southern Quebec, and they decided, kind of as a last-minute thing, to include a population of Inuit women from the far north of Canada. And they measured the contaminant levels in their breast milk and found that the women in northern Canada had 12 times the levels of PCBs and some other persistent pesticides than did the women in southern Quebec. And this was a wake-up call for the planet. And this was one of the reasons that brought the nations of the world together to negotiate what is now known as the Stockholm Convention on Persistent Organic Pollutants, to get governments from around the world to agree to eliminate those chemicals that could affect such a remote region as the Arctic. And it brought the nations of the world together really to negotiate this treaty. And now we're working very hard to include not only the initial so-called dirty dozen chemicals such as DDT and PCBs that were included in the treaty, but to add new chemicals that we know are contaminating the Arctic. And these are chemicals such as the flame retardants and currently used pesticides that are showing up in wildlife and people at much higher levels in most cases than people in southern latitudes, as we found in our study of St. Lawrence Island.
And can you kind of describe the weather or the climate things that are actually physically bringing this stuff up here?
Sure. Well, these are volatile chemicals. So let's say a pesticide is sprayed on a field in Mexico. When the earth warms up, that chemical comes up into the atmosphere, it becomes a gas, and it tends to move north on prevailing atmospheric currents. When it hits a cold air mass, it settles down for a bit of time. The earth warms up, it continues its northward migration, and when it comes into the Arctic, it hits the coldest air mass on Earth, except for the Antarctic, and the same phenomenon is happening there too. And essentially then the chemical has no place to go. It settles out onto the ocean surface or onto the land, then is eaten by small animals, plankton in the ocean, and then small fish, and then it moves up the food chain. It tends to concentrate in the fatty tissues, and so it bioaccumulates. And so the higher an animal is on the food web, the higher the concentrations of these chemical contaminants that the animal tends to have. And ironically, a human baby is really at the highest level of the food chain because he or she is dependent on breast milk, which is the most nourishing food on Earth. It's the traditional food for babies, but in some cases it's also very highly contaminated. It's still the best food for babies because of so many nutritional benefits that it confers to the child, but it's just so very wrong that that very source of nutrition and bonding between the mother and child is also very highly contaminated. So that's why we're here working in Juneau. That's why we work on the national level and the international level, because we really have to stop the flow of these chemicals, the production of these chemicals that are ending up in traditional foods and breast milk.
Okay. And your organization has both a research mission and an advocacy mission.
Yes.
Is there a tension between those two issues, or is there a temptation for the advocacy to drive the science instead of the other way around?
I think the science that we do is very good. It's very important, and I like to think of the work that we do as, providing the evidence and the information that policymakers need to make good decisions to protect people's health. I don't see a tension. As a scientist, I think, we need this information in order to make reasoned and informed decisions. So I don't see any tension, and I think it's really a good thing to have a good basis of science to make those informed decisions.
Okay. If you're just joining us, this is Forum at 360. We've been discussing how industrial chemicals have found their way into the subsistence food web and the people who rely on it. Do we have any questions from the audience for our panel before we move on? If you do, please just step right up to the microphone. Okay. For the second half of the show, we'll be discussing toxic flame retardants specifically, which is a subset of those industrial chemicals we were just discussing that have been seeping into everything. And these flame retardants are especially ubiquitous in our furniture and our household goods. We've got the trailer for a 2013 documentary called Toxic Hot Seat that will set us up. Let's take a look at that.
Everyone has a fear of fire, right? No one wants to burn up in a fire.
The temperature rises and rises until suddenly everything is burning.
We have developed a method for applying a flame retardant in the home.
Every American home has flame retardants in their couch. These are chemicals measured by pounds and ounces.
Flame retardants accumulate in people and wildlife in places around the world.
And they're toxic and building up in breast milk and being passed on to the next generation. We are in the middle of a giant, uncontrolled experiment on American children.
Why do we have these chemicals in our lives? Why do we have them in our furniture? Why do we have them in our bodies?
Flame retardants are important to save lives.
We already have the highest fire safety standard.
The study is so obscure, we had it translated in English. The industry doesn't have a copy. You can't find it online. We had to go to the National Library of Sweden to get a copy.
If the science shows these chemicals don't really even work, why are we getting the potential risk and none of the benefit?
These fires now are just an absolute toxic soup. I had transitional cell carcinoma, a rare form of cancer found in people in the chemical industry.
I've had coworkers die in fires, and I've had a lot more die of cancer.
I had all these chemicals in my body, including flame retardants. Folks said we need a legislator willing to take on a fight against the chemical industry. And I was like, let's go for it.
Health advocates and the chemical industry are facing off in Washington.
I had no clue the kind of opposition we were going to be facing.
There was a campaign of marketing and deception.
We've brought the signatures of 130,000 Americans with us.
Regular people stood up and said, look, we don't want to take it anymore.
You don't let the fire win. We win.
Who are we listening to when we're being told these chemicals are safe, they work, they protect us, they are essential to our lives? Who are we listening to?
That was the trailer for Toxic Hot Seat, a documentary that came out in 2013. It's now available on iTunes, and there are some screenings happening around the country, including in Juneau. One of the featured characters in the documentary is joining us now. This is Tony Stefani. Tony Stefani is a retired captain of the San Francisco Fire Department. He founded the San Francisco Firefighters Cancer Prevention Foundation in 2006 after being diagnosed with cancer himself. We also have two state senators who have sponsored legislation in recent years to ban the manufacture, distribution, and sale of certain flame retardants associated with health problems in Alaska. Senator Bill WIELECHOWSKI is a Democrat from Anchorage, and Senator Donnie Olson is a Democrat who represents Golovin. Senator Olson is also a licensed medical doctor. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you very much.
So let's start with Tony Stefani. You fought fires professionally for 28 years, is that right?
Yes.
Why are you on a panel now about the dangers of flame retardants?
Good question. I got involved when I put this foundation together, and a foundation that has been dedicated to the early detection and prevention of cancer in both our active and retired firefighters in San Francisco. And because of it and the direction the foundation has been going, from early detection to prevention, I've been involved in various speaking engagements and stuff, and it's brought me to this point right here, basically by speaking to people and letting them know the plight that firefighters across this country, not only San Francisco, are having now with this dilemma.
And tell us about your experience with cancer and what led you, what's the connection between cancer and firefighting? Well,
firefighters work in a very toxic chemical environment. We call it a toxic chemical soup. Every time we enter a building that's on fire. When I entered the department in 1974, we wore no protective breathing equipment. The self-contained breathing apparatus was on the rigs, but we did not don it. There's a lot of tradition, a lot of pride in fighting fires in major metropolitan cities, and it was always who's the toughest, who's going to stay in the longest, who could withstand the heat and the toxins and be able to put that fire out. So it was competition. But then we started seeing firefighters contract and die of cancer, and we knew that it was a major problem. Scott air packs became, the self-contained breathing apparatus became mandatory in 1985 for San Francisco. And they were warned, but they weren't warned enough, because once a fire is extinguished, the chief that's in charge of the fire might take atmospheric readings with a combustible gas indicator. That gives them readings of approximately 4 or 5 different toxins in the atmosphere, but not the full spectrum. And once they deem the atmosphere to be clear, the firefighters take their self-contained breathing apparatus off and continue to do the overhaul process, which could take 2, 3, 4, 5, sometimes 20 hours when you're working on a major structural fire. And during that time, there's a tremendous amount of off-gassing of chemicals. And this off-gassing is extremely toxic. And that's where we're seeing, what we feel is where we're seeing the majority of both active and retired firefighters have contracted cancer because of these exposures.
And you believe your cancer was directly from this occupational hazard?
I was diagnosed with transitional cell carcinoma in my right renal pelvis, my kidney. And I was told by my physician when I was sent to UCSF in San Francisco that the type of cancer that I had was normally found in people that are either cigarette smokers or are exposed to chemicals.
And you weren't moonlighting as a chemical manufacturer?
No, I was not, and I never smoked a cigarette in my life, and I kept myself in excellent shape, knowing that the possibility of getting sick on the job existed, but trying to keep in the best condition I could for the job itself, because it's a very physical, it's a tough job. But this was a shock and a surprise, and now it's a dilemma.
You founded your foundation in 2006, was it? 2006. And this is anecdotal from your experience and kind of from who you've met, but your foundation has taken it much farther than just the anecdotal stories. Like, tell us some of the science that your foundation is involved in.
Well, it's easy to say we're getting cancer because of various exposures, but you have to have hard science. So we've partnered with UCSF on a couple of different studies that we've done. The first thing we did was take a look at cancers of the genitourinary system. In other words, bladder and kidney cancer. Cancers that people in the general public would probably say, firefighters get lung cancer, they don't get kidney cancer, they don't get bladder cancer. That's not true. We do get a lot of bladder cancer. In fact, when I was diagnosed with the transitional cell carcinoma in my renal pelvis, during my time of my recovery, 2 more firefighters at Station 1 where I worked, in a firehouse of 40 combined firefighters, contracted transitional cell carcinoma, only the more common form, bladder cancer. And we were seeing different firefighters in the city at firehouses that were fairly busy contracting bladder cancer. So we told the doctors at UCSF the problem we had, and we put together our first study looking at a specific protein in the urine called nucleic matrix protein. And people who have elevated levels of this particular type of protein could have bladder cancer or kidney cancer or cancer of the ureter. And we did that along with a hemostick to look to see if there was any blood in the urine. And because of the study that we did, we screened 1,286 firefighters, both active and retired. And we picked up 2 retired firefighters and 1 active firefighter with transitional cell carcinoma that at the time of the study began had no clue that they had this disease. So that was the first step. And it's gone from there. It's gone from there to the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health, looking at the causes of death of firefighters in Philadelphia, Chicago, and San Francisco, the largest cohort in the history of the firefighting profession, looking back at the causes of death to 1950. Then the epidemiologists telling us that we don't think there's any problem with your rates of cancer because we consider you to be a healthier population than the population in general. But because of the surveys and the stuff we did, we thought they were going to have a surprise, and they were surprised. And the first part of that study was published last year, and it showed that we had higher rates of oral cancers, higher rates of respiratory cancers, digestive cancers, cancers of the genitourinary system, twice the rate of malignant mesothelioma, and higher rates of prostate cancer in men under the age of 65. And in San Francisco also, we have the largest population of female firefighters of any major metropolitan city in the United States. We have 6 times the rate of breast cancer in our 40 to 50-year-old women. Given it's a small cohort, it's a small group, 200-some plus firefighters, but still, it raises the suspicious flag that we have a major problem.
Okay. And is this, has this preliminary science, has it changed how firefighters do their jobs? Has it changing some of the practices of of fighting fires?
Change comes slowly to that profession in major metropolitan cities, but yes, change is happening. Standard operating procedures after a working fire. Now the firefighters are keeping their self-contained breathing apparatus on longer. We still don't have the capabilities to measure all the different toxins that are in the atmosphere. So it's up to the chief officers that are in the interior of the buildings to keep an eye on the firefighters to make sure that these exposures don't occur. Decontamination occurs now. That never occurred before. I probably clean, and this probably doesn't sound good, my turnout coats and pants and helmet maybe 3 times in my 28 years on the career. It was a badge of honor to be filthy all the time. But we found out that, you know, these things, they're toxic. You wrap them around your neck, you're exposing yourself over and over again to the same carcinogens. So that type of stuff is happening in the profession.
And Senator Olson, you live in rural Alaska, and you're a medical doctor. Have you seen evidence of health effects from toxics in your communities?
Well, I worked there at the Norton Sound Health Corporation, and before I was a health aide, before I went to medical school, and so there has been a fair amount of engagement with people that do have chronic diseases, and a lot of emphasis has been put on the cancers that are there, but I've also seen it in other aspects of life where you have metabolic diseases, mainly dealing with the thyroid. You have other kind of developmental delays that are in smaller children, and that's where I tend to categorize those things that are there. And part of the reason has been pointed out before is that the area that both Vi Waghiyi and I come from, if you think of it from a global standpoint, as was talked about the air masses, we get the jet stream coming over from Asia, and Asia kind of has an unregulated area of chemical use, and we see some of the stuff that comes over from the Shanghai factories that are getting over here by the jet stream. As was pointed out, was that as the air cools, the airborne contaminants are starting to settle down in the snow, on the land, on the water. And as well as if you look at the Bering Sea, which is just on the opposite side of the Pacific gyre that's there, is coming up through, it funnels itself right down to a choke point there in the Bering Straits. And that's why you have that's one of the reasons you have a lot of concentration of these heavy metals, of the chemicals that are not good for you, not just in their free state, but also with the animals that are eating them, the animals that are sequestering them, and as you go on up to the food chain, it starts getting more and more concentrated, so that when people eat them, like seal oil, walrus, muktuk, those kind of things, especially the fatty parts of it, and the fish in particular, where you don't have a free access from people that live up the rivers, they are also highly exposed to some of these contaminants that are wreaking havoc on not just us, but the population that's coming after us.
And why target, at the state level? There's a big global issue. It's harder to deal with, but also something different policymakers are trying to deal with. Why? How have you tried to tackle it at the state level in the state legislature? This would be Senator WIELECHOWSKI or Senator Olson.
Go ahead.
So on the state level, we have filed legislation to ban the sale or import, manufacture of furniture, carpets, materials, consumer products that have PDBEs, flame retardants. And that's been a bill that I filed in 2008, 2010, 2012. Senator Olson filed it in 2013 or 14. I'm getting ready to file it again this year.
And let's back up to the alphabet soup pit there. There was PBDEs is an acronym that Senator WIELECHOWSKI mentioned. What's that mean, Pam?
Those are polybrominated diphenyl ethers, and those were the chemicals that were really created by the chemical companies to replace PCBs once PCBs were banned. They're actually brominated versions of chemicals, the PCB chemicals, that are also very similar in structure to PCBs. They also have similar health effects, so they tend to affect the thyroid. They also affect the neurodevelopment of children. So we know now that there have been some very important studies that have come out of the University of California at Berkeley and also Columbia University's Children's Health Center that show that when children are exposed to these PBDEs when they're in their mother's womb, that their intellectual capacity is reduced into adulthood because they are affected. and exposed at such an early age. So these chemicals have a wide range of effects. And now we're also finding that the chemical industry, as those chemicals are being phased out now, are replacing the PBDEs with other chlorinated compounds known as chlorinated tris and some other chemical flame retardants that are being used in a wide range of children's products, in building materials, in carpets, in electronics. So the bill that we're hoping Senator WIELECHOWSKI will introduce soon targets some of those newer classes of chemicals that the chemical industry is replacing the older chemicals as they're being phased out. We call them unfortunate or regrettable substitutions, because as these chemicals are phased out, the chemical industry just introduces new molecules. We're trying to get ahead of the problem, because we can't keep repeating this problem and exposing generations of children to harmful chemicals that have multi-generational effects.
And so you ticked off a list of legislation that's been introduced but hasn't gotten through the legislative process. What's the resistance been in the Alaska legislature?
Well, the chemical companies have an extremely powerful and effective lobby, and they have managed to kill the bill every single year. In 2012, we actually had the bill pass the Senate, and it was promptly killed in the House. And they have been extremely effective in lobbying legislators about the dangers, the false dangers of banning this dangerous chemical.
And you had mentioned that when we spoke the other day that you had an aide that actually tested some of the materials in your office in the Capitol. Tell us what she found.
I did. So, you know, we were trying to bring this home to legislators about how important this problem was. You know, to me, a fundamental function of government is to educate and protect its citizens. What could be more fundamental than protecting the citizens against dangerous substances that we know exist, that we know safer alternatives exist at a reasonable cost, that won't cost consumers anymore? And so you see parents who have kids and their kids are out crawling on carpets. Well, most parents don't realize that those carpets are full of toxic flame retardants. Those kids are putting things in their mouth like maybe clothes or maybe toys that are coated with toxic flame retardants. The couches, the furniture they sit on are usually full of toxic flame retardants. And so we were trying to bring this home to legislators and trying to relate it to them. So we actually had a staffer of mine go and pull a piece of fiber, a little chunk of fiber from a piece of furniture in the legislature. And I'm not going to say whose office it came from or where it came from, but we pulled a piece of, we did it from actually a couple of them, and we had it tested, and sure enough, it was full, pounds and pounds of toxic flame retardants in furniture right in the Capitol. And we told this to legislators. And you know, we were just trying to bring this issue home to people, how, look, you yourself, every day when you go into the Capitol, are sitting on toxic flame retardants, and you don't need to do it. And our function as a government should be to protect our citizens, and we're falling down on that job.
And Tony, you look like you're about to jump in on something about the flame retardants themselves, right?
Firefighters, well, we're exposed like everybody is, the general population, on a daily basis in our homes, in our workplace. But when it comes to a working fire, it's a different set of circumstances because these polybrominated diphenyl ethers off-gas both furans and dioxins. And part of that dioxin congenite profile, there's some very, very strong carcinogenic chemicals in there. And we've had the levels measured in a little pilot study that we did in firefighters in San Francisco, a small cohort of 12 firefighters, but they showed 100 times the average of anybody, you know, anybody in the general population that you'd find with these dioxin levels. And it's a real frightening, scary situation. And the other thing too is we don't know, and you know, I've talked to people in science that look at this problem, and I asked them, you know, do these chemicals exacerbate other chemicals that we're in contact with? And they can't really answer the question right now. So we're more or less the canaries being sent into the cave.
And Senator WIELECHOWSKI, you alluded to sort of that the flame retardants might not actually be retarding flames much. Is that something you can speak to in your occupational experience, Tony, or anyone on the panel?
Well, if you look at a couch, what's the first thing that catches on fire?
The upholstery, right?
Usually the upholstery, the material. The foam is underneath. if you've got a material on the outside of the couch to begin with that has a tight weave, basically that stuff is not going to really catch on fire rapidly to burn through that and to get into the foam. It's been proven that when the material itself catches on fire and the foam catches on fire, it just goes rapidly. That 12-second delay that these chemicals are supposed to give you really does not exist. And the way it was sort of a sneaky thing, and actually it's shown in Toxic Hot Seat, the way the chemical industry went about testing these chemicals in regular circumstances where they were, where you had, well, controlled circumstances is what I want to say. They were loaded with the amounts of flame retardants that you'd find maybe in a NASA mission, where there'd be pounds and pounds and pounds and pounds of this stuff, so it looked like the couches were not catching on fire when they put it up against a regular couch without any flame retardants. So there was games that were played.
And this has been corroborated in the 2012 Chicago Tribune series on this as well, called Playing with Fire, where they really dug into the science and all of the standards and pieces of evidence that the chemicals industry has used to try to make the fire safety versus gradual exposure to cancer-causing or questionable chemicals thing, and really took apart the fire safety argument too. So I actually listened back to some of the testimony and read back through some of the testimony on some of these past bills that you guys have worked on, and that 11 seconds or 12 seconds had come up in quite a bit in some of these discussions. Let's listen to one doctor's testimony in committee in 2011 on one of the flame retardant bills that Senator WIELECHOWSKI sponsored.
I will tell you about an Alaska 6-month-old child who was in a crib. And in the crib, he had a fire-retardant pillow and a non-fire retardant mattress. He was laying on it. A candle happened to spill over onto the bed, and the crib burned. The mattress burned almost instantly. The child sustained 50% very, very deep burns that required amputation of some toes. And yes, his upper body was completely unburned, the part that was on the pillows. So I think we need to be careful before we just ban stuff that has been shown to be effective.
And we've got one more excerpt from later in the same meeting. It begins with Senator Fred Dyson asking a question.
Are you familiar with an organization called Citizens for Fire Safety?
I am.
Are they a credible organization?
I think they are, yes. I think they're made up of many people like me who have no particular interest in the chemical companies. Numerous fire departments, numerous firefighters, and many, many burn dogs. So yes, I think they're credible.
And Senator WIELECHOWSKI, I think you were in the room during this meeting in 2011. Do you remember who that doctor was?
I do.
Yeah. Why don't you tell us about who, his name was Dr. David Heimbach,
Yes.
and what did you find out a few months later about Dr. David Heimbach?
So as we went to the floor to vote on this, I had several legislators tell me they were going to vote for this bill, but they were so persuaded by Dr. Heimbach that they decided not to vote for this bill. So it turns out that Dr. Heimbach was a medical doctor who had testified all across the country on similar types of bills opposing legislation to protect citizens from these toxic substances. Well, it turns out that Dr. Heimbach was telling a different story in every state. In some states, it was a 6-year-old child who burned. In some states, it was a 4-year-old child. In some states, it was a 2-year-old child. And it turns out that Dr. Heimbach completely made these stories up. And these were, this was documented by an incredible investigative report done by the Chicago Tribune, and also done by Rich Maurer at the Alaska Dispatch News, who did a fantastic multi-part series on how this doctor came into Alaska and just flat out made up stories. Not only did he make up stories, he was getting paid by Citizens for Fire Safety over $100,000 per year to come in and testify in cases like this. He never disclosed that. He flat out lied to the Alaska legislature, And he's since lost his medical license, and and he can never reapply for it again.
And there's one more piece to that too. That organization, Citizens for Fire Safety, the Tribune series actually shows that Citizens for Fire Safety was a front group for the chemical industry. Yeah. And the story he told about the infant burning the crib, it may have been fabricated. That's all in the Anchorage Daily News and in the Chicago Tribune series. A lot of this is the subject of toxic hot seat as well, right, Tony?
Yes, it is.
And tell us a little bit more about how you got involved with that film and how that lines up with the Tribune series. And
I was speaking at a one-day symposium at UC Berkeley. I was invited to talk about the firefighters' perspective on flame retardant chemicals and our concerns with these chemicals that are being used and what they do to us at the scene of a fire. And when I was done speaking that day, when we had an intermission about noon, I was approached by a woman that was a film producer that said that she was interested in this flame retardant dilemma and she wanted to do a documentary on flame retardants. Would I be interested in being interviewed for this documentary? And I said, sure. But some time went by, a few months went by, and I completely forgot about it. And then I got a call from her one day and said, hi, my name is Kirby Walker. I'm a film producer, and I spoke to you after the UC Berkeley symposium, and I'd like to do this documentary on toxic flame retardant chemicals. Are you interested in being interviewed? And I said, sure. So I was interviewed, and things just happened to fall in place. Kirby did not know at the time that the Chicago Tribune was doing this investigative series. Kirby was following Senator Mark Leno from California with the same dilemma that the senators here are having on the 4 or 5 different times trying to get Technical Bulletin 117 overturned with the same doctor involved. It was amazing, and she partnered with James Redford, the son of Robert Redford, who is an excellent documentary film producer and director. And the next thing I knew, I was invited to talk before a congressional committee in Washington, D.C. in support of the Safe Chemicals Act. So they followed me to Washington. They got the information from the Center from the Chicago Tribune, and everything just fell in place in a perfect timeline, actually, to come up with this film. That's basically it in a nutshell.
Right. So back to the legislature, has all this exposure of some of these nefarious deeds in this documentary and in the reporting and locally and by the Tribune. Has exposing all this changed the conversation at all in the Alaska legislature? Do you know what's the outlook for the bill this year?
Well, we'll see. It should. We're going to file this bill soon, and we're paring it down to make it as simple as possible, to make it as low cost as possible. We're trying to get it to be a zero fiscal note, which means it won't cost the state anything if possible, because we have tight financial times. And I certainly hope that the legislature will take a hard look at this, and look at what's happened in the past, and look at the way that the people of Alaska, the way the legislature has been lied to. And I hope every legislator is offended by that. And I hope every Alaskan is offended by that enough to rise up and say, enough is enough. We're not going to allow chemical companies to come in here and pollute our environment, pollute our kids, and get away with this and not do anything about it. I think we have a moral obligation. What could be more important than protecting the children, protecting the people of this state? And that should be our #1 obligation. And I hope the legislature takes action on this bill.
Senator Olson, did you have any comment on that?
Well, I think that we're certainly optimistic that something's going to be coming out this time now that we've got the facts straighter. But it is fairly compelling when somebody tells a story like Heimlich or Dr. Heimbach about some of these stories that were there. And that's what played at their heartstrings of people that were compelled by his testimony, falsely so, but still. I would say that atmosphere on a subsurface level still prevails up there to a certain degree, and so it's not something that seems so commonsensical to us. But to a legislator who's got other ideas, other agendas that are out there, they are sometimes a little harder to go ahead and convince. Partly because many of the legislators aren't dealing with little children. That just so happens in my case. I've got a 7-month-old, so every time he sticks something in his mouth, that mucosal membrane is just absorbing everything that's out there, including all these toxins that are there, which is very concerning to somebody like me, realizing that, you know, he could very well end up with a metabolic problem that I'd want to say that I would have tried to stop as I was a legislator, and, you know, we'll continue on, and then one of these days I'll be out of the legislature. So I would say that, at least at this point, it's still an uphill struggle to try and convince people that there is this idea, because they think there's a certain degree of platitude that's out there that we are being taken care of by the FDA and those other people. But I'm saying that that's not the case, that we are still an industry oriented legislature that all they think, a lot of things that push them are profits.
And I don't know, Pam, you've had some experience on the national level too with some of these issues. What are some of the barriers? Like, why isn't this an EPA or FDA subject that they're on top of?
Well, the law that governs toxic chemicals in the U.S. is the Toxic Substances Control Act, which was enacted in 1976. It's very much outdated. It's the only major environmental law that has never been updated, and we have so much more new science concerning the health effects of these chemicals. We now have over 80,000 chemicals on the market. Most of them have been allowed on the market without safety testing. Only a handful have ever been banned. The law has not even been able to ban asbestos, which is a known carcinogen. So it's a law that's very badly broken, and that's one of the reasons why it's so important for states to take action to protect their own citizens, because the federal government certainly hasn't, and this law is badly broken. Congress is dysfunctional, so we think that a lot of good things can happen on a state level and should happen, and that's one of the reasons why we're so strongly supporting this legislation that would phase out this class of chemicals, the toxic flame retardants, because we really need to get ahead of this problem. We have an opportunity to protect the health of people living in Alaska. We have a lot of good reasons why people in Alaska are more highly exposed. We spend a lot more time indoors, so we're more highly exposed because our homes are insulated against the cold. We have people who are reliant on traditional foods, and we know that those are already contaminated with many of these flame retardants. So there are a lot of reasons why this is especially important here in Alaska. We've also enjoyed a lot of support for this type of legislation in Alaska from firefighters, from healthcare professionals such as the Alaska Nurses Association, from parents, students, scientists. So Alaskans care a lot about this.
We've only got a few minutes left. If anyone in our audience wants to ask anyone on our panel a question, please step up to the microphone. Nope. Okay. Yeah.
And what he did. And I was disappointed that there wasn't anything that I can recall being addressed right after that to talk about why that legislation was set aside so quickly and why it wasn't revisited last year. But so I'm glad that's coming back. And so thank you. And hopefully I can do something about it myself.
And why don't you address some of what are the ground rules for someone, when they address the legislature and they try to influence how it goes on the public record?
This has been a hot topic in previous years. We don't put people under oath when they come before us, and some have suggested that we should. But if you do lie before the legislature, I think there are ramifications. And I think in this case, this doctor lied before multiple legislatures across the country. He ultimately lost his medical license. And he can never, again, reapply under the terms of his turning that over to become a doctor again. And I think that's appropriate. But outside of that, we did look into possible remedies for Alaska, and it just wasn't something that, we looked into possibly prosecuting him, and the state ultimately determined that they weren't going to prosecute him.
What can the regular Alaskan do about this issue? Is there a safe way, if not changing policy and regulations and legislation, you know, if I just want to go to the store and buy something that I think is safe, how do I do that?
That's a good question. A lot of companies are phasing out these toxic flame retardants on their own. However, I think it's important that we recognize that we can't shop our way out of this problem, because the problem is that chemical companies now are not required to disclose whether these toxic flame retardants are included in the products that we bring into our homes, and that includes children's toys, nap mats, you know, nursing pillows and things like that. There's no requirement for disclosure. So that's why we need policies in place that not only disclose the contents of these products, but also phase them out, because as Tony and others have noted, these chemical flame retardants are largely ineffective in protecting against fires.
So it's not like there's some label out there that I can just take a look at and say, okay, this is thumbs up or thumbs down. It's really trickier than that.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Any other questions from our audience?
Hi, thank you very much for the efforts that you're making to bring this to light before the legislature. It's very much appreciated. I know for food and some cosmetics that there are databases like the Skin Deep database for cosmetic and skincare products. Is there any sort of effort by any national organization to give us tools to be able to find out what kinds, you know, where these products are, and you know, resources for us as consumers?
Do you want to take that, Vi, or Pam?
Well, there have been organizations. Center for Environmental Health has done products testing, and we've participated in those, and we've actually tested nap mats and other children's products here in Alaska and found toxic flame retardants in a wide range of products that are everyday products in our homes. Yes, so there is a national effort to test these products, and then a lot of pressure on companies to get the toxic flame retardants out. And there are major corporations like IKEA, Lazy Boy, and others that are phasing these chemicals out. So it takes, I think, a combination of policy efforts, such as, you know, what we're hoping to achieve here in Alaska, as well as market pressure from people who are buying these things to get these companies to get these toxic chemicals out of the products, because they just shouldn't be there.
Okay. And we've run out of time for this forum at 360. We've been talking about industrial contaminants in the subsistence food web and our homes and our bodies. Thanks for joining us on Forum at 360.
Funding for Forum at 360 comes from JRE Juneau Real Estate, LG Rayfeld Mertz LLC, Alaska Airlines, Fjord Flying Service, and Joe and Darla Buck.